Good evening. Thank you for joining us for Political Talk on another PolitiPod Live. I'm Matt Nisanoff, and I'm usually joined by Tom Bickle, but he has the night off. We're here to discuss current political events. Tonight, we'll cover the Brown University shooter, turning coat. 60 Minutes shows up, green light in New York City, and if we have time, a Trump dump. We'll also have our regular segments, Election Central, and a new one called Issue Update. Starting off with the Brown University shooter. The Brown University shooter was found having committed suicide in a storage space up in New Hampshire. Law enforcement held an extended press conference with each agency, including the Providence Police, Rhode Island State Police, the FBI, the ATF, the Rhode Island Prosecutor's Office, and others, each taking turns detailing how professional and prepared and how expertly their agents worked together. The tip on how to find the body was from a post on Reddit. He's identified as Claudio Valentin, 48, former Brown student and a Portuguese national. He's also been tied to the murder of an MIT professor in his home in Brooklyn, Massachusetts, days after the killings at Brown. Valente and the professor apparently had known each other back in the days from Portugal, where they had gone to school together and at a particular university there in Portugal. Some say Valentine's vehicle was identified using Flock, a controversial AI-powered traffic camera company, but an eyewitness identified only as John reported the vehicle to police and suggested they check it out as he saw and spoke with Valentine before the killings of the two students and the wounding of 10 others at Brown University. It does leave a lot to wonder why and how things took place the way they did, and actually how he was able to escape and spend so many days on his own, making his way over to Brookline, Massachusetts, and then up to New Hampshire. However, that's a closed story now, as one of the law enforcement agents said at the press conference. They have a certain type of closure, not really, but hopefully it's enough that the victims' families are able to move on from here. I don't have much else to say about that. I think all of that speaks mostly for itself. And I don't know what Tom would say. He's not here, so he can't say anything. But perhaps we'll bring up this subject next week. Moving on to our next issue, the turning coat. Several factions have been showing in the conservative movement. There's fractions among two or three different groups. Earlier this week, media reported that a group of leadership from the conservative organization Heritage Foundation walked out and joined a more recent gang formed by former Vice President Michael Pence called the AAF. This move said to have brought together some of them who are defending Tucker Carlson's interview of a racist social media influencer. No need to name him here. An official who stayed with Heritage said those who had gone had cleared the way for a stronger, more focused team. If so, apparently Heritage Foundation did not find a way to do that on their own. The same fight over anti-Semitism and how that relates to the conservative movement now had a strong influence on the recent Turning Point festivities. There's the anti Semitism from the conservatives and the anti Semitism of the alt right, and they seem to have clashed at the event. Ben Shapiro said that Tucker Carlson had promoted Nick Fuentes how Nick's without addressing Nick's big dinner with Trump, and I believe Ye was there as well. Shapiro also called out Candace Owens for spreading conspiracy theories without addressing how, if that was perhaps because she'd beaten him to the punch. Carlson would later give a speech in which he declared the Turning Point founder, Charlie Kirk, would have wanted open dialogue and would not be deplatforming fellow conservatives for having differing views. Though it's also true that Kirk specifically banned Fuentes in the past. Carlson went on to say that he's not anti Semitic because his religious faith, quote, in his religious faith, quote, it is immoral to hate people for how they were born, period, unquote. Then declared that white men are the real victims of racism, and all of his white, and all the while, the Epstein files are dismissed in an alleged attempt to make pedophiles overlooked again. On to our segments, more regular segments. This is Election Central. We talk more about elections, what's coming up, but also some news from the world of elections. Cynthia Loomis, who's one of the senators from Wyoming, has resigned. She said she didn't feel she had another 6 year term of office in the Senate in her, and confided how safe a confidentially, considering how safe a Republican seat that is. Does it really matter who it is? An argument could be made that it doesn't, with another retirement announcement that happened until there was another retirement announcement about a half hour later. The lead and only announced candidate for New York's Republican nomination for governor quit. Pardon me, this is Elise Stefanik. But she didn't just quit the governor's race, she also quit her house in the U.S. She also quit her seat in the U.S. House once it was clear that Trump did not actively dissuade other Republicans from considering the governor's race. This has cleared the way for someone who had talked about maybe running. There's a guy down in Long Island who Trump didn't endorse almost immediately on her getting out of the way. Considering all she had done as a Super MAGA supporter, this is pretty remarkable. Allegedly, not having everything handed to her was a crushing blow. The primary in New York is in June, June 23rd, and the general election is in November. So it looks like the field has been cleared for the other candidate. However, on the Democratic side, the field is not so clear. This allows the Democratic governor, and not necessarily universally loved, Kathy Hochul, an easy road to the general, not so much, because she still faces a primary. And that will be against her former lieutenant governor, Antonio Delgado. But she's not running away from it. She's going to face the primary, and we'll see how it plays out. So good on her. Well done. December 30th has a couple of elections coming up. There's a special general runoff election for Santa Clara County in California, and that's for the county assessor. It's a ballot by mail, and all registered voters have already been sent the ballot. The previous election had four candidates, none of whom received over even 40%, much less the 50% needed to win. So the top two candidates are going head to head on December 30th. Rishi Kumar, a tech guy, versus Nasa Filger, an assistant assessor. If you live in Santa Clara County, make certain you send in your ballot as a registered voter. It's your chance to have a say in that election. There's a special election for Iowa State Senate District 16. Democrats broke the Republican supermajority for the Iowa Senate earlier this year, and one of those who helped with that has died. Senator Claire Celsey, for whom we offer condolences to her family and friends and constituents. This seat will, once again, in this case, hold whether or not Republicans move on to regaining a supermajority or if Democrats continue with breaking that. The Republican is Lucas Lofton versus Democratic candidate Renee Hardman. South Carolina has some local elections, some local special elections. There's one in the town of for the town council in Lata. It's Norris Barmack versus Melindy Finkley. There's another one down there in South Carolina as well. The town of Silver Street has a special election for mayor and one of the council seats. Now, here's the twist: no one filed for the seats that are going to, so the election will be write in votes. This means literally a handful of votes could take one of those seats. So if you live in the town of Silver Street, it's really important that you are participating in this election on December 30th. If you ever wanted to make a difference, literally a handful of folks can win these seats. Write-in candidate has been announced for mayor, but not for the council seat, and that's been confirmed by voter registration department there in the county, Newport County. So if you're in Silver Street, or you know someone who is a resident of Silver Street, South Carolina, this could be your moment. I'll also have a note on recall elections. Each state each state has different rules. For instance, Virginia says there has to be a particular charge against you, against an elected official, in order to have a recall election. In South Carolina, recall elections are not allowed at all, so you cannot recall an elected official once they're in office. While in Maine, you do not have to have any reason for a recall. Anything you say is fine as long as you have a certain number of signatures on a petition saying that you want to have a recall. In Freedom, Maine, there's a local office a local official who was accused of going around the process of using the town's materials, resources, and had his own street repaved at the expense of the town. And there were enough signatures on a petition for a recall, and of the 150 people who voted, 91 said no, and therefore Rene Ouellette retains his seat. On to the next issue we have for tonight, which is 60 Minutes shows up. You may have heard about the 60 Minutes segment on how ICE has kidnapped and deported uh, people and how the article was removed from being aired. Well, a version of it, about 17 minutes long, has made its way to social media platforms. What we see here is a group of Venezuelans who went through that process come out to discuss what they saw, what happened to them, and it combines footage not only from the United States administration, but some from internet influencers. I'll mention how that happened in just a minute, that show the details of the inside. When you see it, you can understand why the Ministry of Engagement demanded that the piece be removed before being shown on 60 Minutes. Why these people? Well, that's part of the evidence that was claimed to be held by ICE was that they were criminals. And it was determined in part because they had tattoos, not specific gang tattoos, just having tattoos. El Salvador took them after a payment of $4.7 million from the US and put these folks in a maximum security prison. Beatings were regular. Molesting the prisoners was a regular practice by the guards, and stress positions are used constantly as a form of control. The conditions horribly overcrowded. Sleeping areas have stacks without any sort of bedding. The lights are on 24 hours a day, and only dirty water is available. So you're literally drinking the water that was used to bathe in, and some from the toilets. And this helped make inmates sick, which easier to control people who are sick. The El Salvadoran president likes to let folks know what's going on. I mentioned I'd come back to the whole social media influencer issue and how that happened. He likes to have people see that he's being tough. And his way of doing that is to let social media influencers tour the facility. So these younger kids with cameras are walking around inside and have, in effect, provided evidence of what's happening inside. Now, a group of students in the US from California have taken those tapes, started mapping things out. They're also using satellite images and are reconstructing where things are and how things are put together in the inside of the facilities. So we have some idea of where the places are that we've been talking about or seeing and that they do exist. They're also tracking other documents for the records of what's happening. That might come in handy someday. When US cabinet members visit the prison for a PR conference, one of the cabinet members of the United States administration showed up at this prison in El Salvador and stood in front of one of the cages where prisoners were held. And actually, they had brought in the El Salvadoran gang members they do have in the prison to fill that particular cage. So when she was standing there giving her speech about the criminals that they're sending off to El Salvador, she was standing in front of actual criminals, but they were El Salvadorans who were brought in who did have the correct tattoos and other marks so that they could show that they were criminals, but not the Venezuelans who had been deported there from the U.S. They were not in those cages when that press conference took place. But that's what we're doing, right? We're sending our criminals. Well, actually, not so much. The lawyers in the U.S., there have been a number of lawyers who are representing some of the Venezuelans and some who are helping out, and they decided to research what has actually taken place with these folks who have been deported. And what they found is they looked at records from all 50 states in the United States. They checked the records in Venezuela, and they also checked the records in any third party country that people had been in. For instance, when it's current US policy that when you're filing for asylum, you cannot currently be in the US. You have to go to a third party country and live there until you're called and said, you're told, well, come on up. We have a court hearing date for you. Come on up. Well, in this case, the lawyers also checked that third party country to see if there were any records of any criminal misdoing for the people that they were tracking. Now, there are hundreds of these Venezuelans, hundreds that were deported out, three, 400, and they searched them all. The records on all of the people that they knew that were there. And of the several hundred, only eight had any sort of violations, and none were violent crimes. They did have tattoos, but only eight of them had any kind of a criminal misdoing in their records, and those were not violent crimes. So, who are we actually sending? Just simply guys who have tattoos. That's the crime. Everything they went through has been recorded, and I don't think this is the last we've heard of this, even if 60 Minutes quashed the report by the demands of a Trump supporter who works as a current CBS executive. You'll be hearing more about this, I have a feeling. Ah, we now have an issue update. Now, that's a new segment that we have, and that's looking back at some of the other things we've spoken on over the past few weeks. And because we talk about them when they're happening, we don't always know what happens. And so we're doing a little bit of an update to talk about how things have gone since then, since we first mentioned them. For instance, we've talked about ICE being in the streets and there being over 100,000 US citizens, although they're claiming that no US citizens are being arrested and potentially deported, that they are all foreigners who have criminal records. But looking over records, what we do know now is over 100,000 people who have been arrested and some cases deported are actually US citizens who have been kidnapped and deported. So, Illinois, with the latest um, infiltrations into Chicago, Illinois has established laws setting limits so the overreach into the courts, hospitals, and daycares are challenged, saying that that's not acceptable. The DOJ responded by filing a lawsuit against Governor Pritzker and the AG, the Attorney General. And just yesterday, the Supreme Court decided that law enforcement can be federalized, but troops, National Guard troops, cannot be deployed as there's no evidence of any kind of an actual rebellion. This decision may extend to the cases that have been brought up from Los Angeles and Portland and Washington, D.C. itself. So they might benefit from the ruling. We've mentioned recall elections even in this very episode earlier. Here's an update on another one of them. This is in York County, Nebraska. They had a recall on Leroy Ott. He was accused of telling a constituent of his that he supported solar projects and then apparently changed his mind before the actual vote on the issue related to solar power and then refused to talk to her about why he changed his mind, although she says she repeatedly reached out to him. His counterclaim when the recall was filed was that he's just a good guy and he listens. Well, apparently the voters don't agree with him, as does they do agree with the person who filed the recall, and not with now former council member Ott, uh, by 351 to 262. So he has been recalled, and there will have to be an election, a special election, in order to fill the seat. So we'll let you know when York County has that special election. Another issue update is on Colombia. Now, we know about the military buildup around Venezuela, the blockade and taking of ships that have oil, possibly going to China, which means that China will be has been drawn into the dispute. And there's some other unforeseen consequences. In this case, Colombia and its rebels, the ELN, are saying that there's been, because of the American buildup of military in the area, that justifies their continued war. And the rebels have attacked again. Now, Colombia's president says the attacks by the ELN have to be responded to, and he has to respond with attacks of his own in retaliation. So instead of a grand peace that brings world peace to all corners of the globe, we have wound up sparking another war. And one last issue update here. This is from France. You may remember the saga of the prime ministers there, where they went through several in a very short period of time. The most recent person who was named to the post had to resign because he couldn't get the assembly to come to an agreement about budgets. Then he was brought back on again. He was renamed as prime minister, even though he had just been, even though he had just resigned. Well, he's on the edge of doing it again. Perhaps he was renamed to the position, and now it's his job to get that budget agreed to from all the factions. And in fact, one of President Macron's major pieces of pension reform was to raise the age of when people could start to receive the pension, which the French people did not like. You may recall the yellow vests and riots in the streets, protesters marching to oppose this. Well, that so called reform has been halted in an effort to work out a deal on the budget. But the deal is not happening. Now the PM's moved through something the US knows all too well, which is a form of a continuing resolution, meaning that they agree to fund basic services for a couple of weeks at a time, and then they see what they can do to make a deal while that's in place. In other words, the next crisis point for the Prime Minister of France will be in January now. So we'll see if he's able to work with the size that he has to in the assembly to create a budget and continue on, or if he's able to perhaps persuade them to do more continuing resolutions, or perhaps he'll be out again. Stay tuned for updates right here on PolitiPod Live. On to our next issue. Uh, we have a another issue which is pardon me for the difficulties with our technical doings tonight. The next issue is actually what's called New York's green light law. And what that is New York has decided that they will issue driver's license without verifying citizenship status. When the Trump administration heard about this, they decried that as being discrimination against the federal government. Now, I didn't see the actual filing, so I don't know how that's justified, but That was the claim. And this past week, a U.S. district judge found that they had failed to support that claim. The court's job, the judge said, is to, quote, assess whether the Trump administration's arguments establish that the law violates the U.S. Constitution's supremacy clause. And that's the clause that allows the federal laws precedent over state laws. Just another loss in court, and drivers in New York City will be driving in New York City will be a little bit safer due to that. Now's the time for that. There you go. Time for we have enough time to get into the Trump dump this episode and talk about some things that have been going on related to the fella on your screen there. Well, now you know you've probably heard of the Navy's most recent orders to put together a class of battleships that was announced by President Trump, and it will be the largest battleships with hypersonic weapons and nuclear capacity. It said, "What could possibly go wrong?" Now, you've heard about the release of the Epstein documents. We'll get to a little bit more on that. But for right now, the point is that um, Bill Clinton was named in some of the documents. And this is one of the canards that the right has been working very hard on, that they bring up a lot. And that is that, well, Bill Clinton's in the Epstein papers, therefore you don't want them released, Democrats, because your guy is in it. And the response of just about every Democrat I've ever heard has been, well, if he's in it, let's find out why. And then if he's guilty of something, let's let him face the consequences of that. Because the Democrats are saying consequences are what happened from that kind of behavior. Whereas for the Republicans, the consequences are that they protect the pedophile. Clinton himself replied to the most recent Trump dump of documents from the Epstein files, and he challenged Trump to release everything that he's got on Clinton. Now, at a recent press conference, Trump came out and said he's always kind of liked Bill Clinton. He doesn't have a problem with him, and he's always had a good relationship with Bill Clinton. No word on his taking up Clinton's challenge to release documents that have Clinton's name in them. We'll have to keep an eye on that. And we will. There's also the whole idea that Bill Clinton, pardon me, there's also the idea that Donald Trump has brought peace to the world. Uh, in the case of Israel's disputes, he says that he's brought eternal peace to the Middle East, and that he has actually brought peace in 9 other conflicts around the world. So I thought we'd take just a few minutes and look at those peace deals. Let's see what he's actually what's actually taken place there. The peace deals and their results. Now, the first one that he mentioned was Azerbaijan versus Albania. Now, that's actually not a conflict that exists or has existed. So I don't know that we can really count that one as something that he has brought peace to, because the conflict didn't exist. The next one on the list is Cambodia and Thailand. Now, that's a very real conflict that has been going on. However, since the Trump peace deal was announced, the attacks have actually continued. In fact, Thai officials have now said that Trump's statement of peace doesn't, quote, reflect an accurate understanding of the situation, unquote. Of course, there's Israel and the Palestinians. The eternal peace that was brought isn't. There have been continuing attacks. In fact, yesterday there was mortar fire from Israel that wounded 10 more Palestinians. And at the same time, Israel is saying that that only happened because the missiles veered off course. Doesn't particularly say where they were actually heading or where they were supposed to go, but they veered off course and uh, 10 Palestinians were wounded. So the conflict, at the very least, you can say, the conflict is continuing. It hasn't been resolved. There is no eternal peace. Another one with Israel is Israel versus Iran. Now, this is one that was mentioned. In fact, because Israel and Iran swapped missile attacks for a 12-day period. And after they stopped attacking each other, Trump said that was because of his peace deal negotiating. So that's one. Let's say that has resolved all the issues between Israel and Iran, and that there'll be no more missile attacks either way. So okay, one. It does not extend apparently into Syria because now Israel and Syria, that's having its own internal problems, are going after each other. Now internally, there's a faction that has challenged the government, and they were supposed to be making peace and working things out. And as of last week, that was broken after the rebels restarted their attacks. And in fact, the town of or the city of Aleppo has been the fighting point this past week. And Israel, who has a portion of its country, some occupied territory up in the north called Golan Heights, that extends in or as a part of Syria. It is said that troops have extended from the Golan Heights into the closest villages in Syria. So Israeli troops have moved in as well. So that doesn't sound like peace. That sounds like something that we have to watch out for. Rwanda versus the Congo. Now, this has been an ongoing conflict, and in fact, there was some negotiation. Rwanda and Congo were going to move into a phase of negotiating in peace. However, Rwanda has an ally that's a group of mercenaries or a group of militia, and that group was not part of the negotiations. They have, in fact, continued their attacks in the Congo and have even taken over major cities in both the north and south of Congo. The city in the south was just taken recently, so not so much of a peace. Back to the Middle East, there's the conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia. Now, there's a dam in the Nile, and this is the cause of the conflict. They're both arguing for it, control of it. And that has not been resolved, so that conflict continues. And there's India and Pakistan. Pakistan. Now, the Pakistans famously have given credit to Donald Trump for resolving the conflict, and in fact, even suggested that he should receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his actions in bringing a peace between India and Pakistan. India, however, did not agree that that was the case. And in fact, Trump has retaliated against them by raising their tariffs because They didn't acknowledge or say that Trump had brought peace to the conflict. Now, the Nobel Peace Prize did go to someone else. However, the FIFA, the football association that is run in the UK, did have some matches in the US and did bring along a FIFA Peace Prize that was awarded to Donald Trump. I believe it was inspired by this conflict between India and Pakistan. So it wasn't the Nobel Peace Prize, but it was a peace prize. And so perhaps you can say between that and whatever the truth is from the earlier example of a conflict he has resolved, I'm going to say that's 1.5 out of 9. There's also Serbia and Kosovo. Now, there hasn't been violence there since the 1990s. However, Kosovo and its leadership has said that Trump had prevented plans that Serbia had to attack. So, a preemptive peace that cannot really be confirmed, but can certainly be spoken of. And that's what has happened with the representatives from Kosovo saying that that's certainly a thing that he worked out, that Trump has worked out. So I don't know what to say about that one. Perhaps that is makes it 2.5, allegedly. Now, the problem also exists that turning to Trump's war on America, there are continued examples where there's an issue here in America where there's not so much peace. So, for instance, there were several disasters that hit at the same time out in Colorado, and Trump refuses to send FEMA money, Federal Emergency Management Agency's money, because there's a Democratic governor. That does not sound like someone trying to bring eternal peace to the world, to my mind. And speaking of the world, Trump has also recalled over 30 career ambassadors or foreign service members. These are the folks who actually make things happen as far as negotiating and as far as diplomacy, and he's simply been recalling them. There's also the issue of his halting a number of 5 or 6 wind power projects, but that is not about international peace, so we'll skip that one for now. Perhaps the bigger issue, and one that we've all known about and we've been talking about repeatedly, has been the Epstein files. Part of the issue here has been that the Republicans have the administration has once again failed. There were requirements in the law, the Transparency Act, that was passed by the House, immediately passed by the Senate. They didn't even, it was hot potato. It went through so quickly that it went straight to the president's desk. And in fact, President Donald Trump signed the Transparency Act that required all of the Epstein files to be released on one particular day. Well, they were partially released and had massive redactions. Hundreds of pages were redacted, blanked out. Here's a picture of a couple of those pages and the sort of thing that's being redacted. Now, the redaction is supposed to be due to protecting victims and their names and how they can be identified. As you can see here, it looks like there's a bit more, but this is how they've agreed to follow the Transparency Act. Or is this just another tactic? This is a Trump tactic to force a prolonged legal battle in an effort to distract from the content. Trump's DOJ now says it will release more documents. And in fact, today it has said they were able to find a million more documents, a million documents, when at one point they were saying that there was no actual documentation that existed. However, they say that they will be releasing all of the documents over time. They just need more time to do it. The Transparency Act itself says, and I'll quote, no record shall be withheld, delayed, or redacted on the basis of embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity, including to any government official, public figure, or foreign dignitary. Redaction can occur if it's about a victim's identity, medical records, personal privacy, or contains child sexual abuse materials, or is jeopardizing a current federal investigation or prosecution. If it contains depiction of death, physical abuse, or injury to a person, have to do with secrets of national security or foreign policy, and anything that's redacted must come with an unclassified explanation of why it's redacted. Now, you may see there's some writing in the upper left corner, and that's the explanation on these documents. A couple of a half dozen words put up in the corner, and that's the explanation. In another related released document, pedophile Epstein and convicted sex offender and former gymnastics doctor Larry Nassar mention Epstein mentions our president, and this is a quote: "Our president Trump, our president shares our love for young nubile girls." Unquote. Now there has been since statements that this document is fake, although why it would be in the records and why it was not vetted by the DOJ is another question. They did release it as part of the file. Representative Ro Khanna, a California Democrat, and Representative Thomas Massie, a Kentucky Republican, both congressmen behind the transparency law, have drafted articles of impeachment for Attorney General Bondi in response to the delayed and non release of documents in the files. We'll see where that goes. Okay, so here we have a look at what's come up with the Epstein count up since its days of the unredacted list not being released, and since everything that's been released so far has been so heavily redacted. I'm afraid we're going to have to continue the count up. Today, that would be 3,844 days since the unredacted Epstein list has not been released. Thanks for joining us for PolitiPod Live for political talk. You're welcome to join us every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, right here on PolitiPod Live. If you want political laughs, you can join us and a half dozen of our friends for our monthly political comedy podcast, PolitiPod. You'll find that at soundcloud.com/politipod. This is usually Tom Bickle, and I'm Matt Nisanoff saying good night.